Assassin's Creed is a series that has had many different faces over the years. From the ever-changing protagonist in each new game, to the changing gameplay styles, narrative direction, and design. Each new installment looks, tells, and plays differently. The only certainty long-time fans have had with this series, for roughly the last decade, is that the next game will be completely different than the one that came before, even if it's built upon the same engine. This vast variation in approach and quality has led many to leave the series and not invest in its future stories. It has also led to avid fans and critics alike to ask tough questions such as, what is the point of this series now, or do Ubisoft even know what they're doing with Assassin's Creed? The previous installment, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, put these questions into a brighter light. That game delivered on a lot of the asks of a vocal minority. It gave us less to no modern day, ignored the Assassin vs Templar conflict, gave no fall damage, gave more naval, tougher combat, RPG dialogue choices, and many other niggly asks that a loud pocket of the community had been clamouring for. What this ended up delivering was a hollow shell of a title that had you feeling more like a DPD delivery driver with zero personality than being a solid RPG game with a well-written main character, let alone feeling like an Assassin's Creed title. For many of the community, and the fanbase, myself included, Odyssey was a breaking point, and the realisation that the series that we once adored was dead, and that the name was now being used as a cash-in moving forward. I was ready to be done with it all. My disappointment with the story, grind, mechanics and design of Odyssey, not to mention its total disregard of real-world history and core concepts of Assassin's Creed titles, managed to erode 11 years of goodwill that 10 mainline games had built up previously. Assassin's Creed Valhalla was announced some point in 2020. I'm in my third lockdown here in the UK, and honestly the passage of time is a luxury that I no longer have. So I can tell you that it was somewhere in the first lockdown, which when looking it up is somewhere between March and June 2020. As always, the CG trailer sold the latest fantasy well, but it was the deep dive interview with the lead writer, released at the same time as the trailer, that actually piqued my interest. But here's the thing, it wasn't actually the content of the deep dive that had me feeling some form of excitement. It was the name of the writer. Darby McDevitt. This was the man who had been the lead writer on Assassin's Creed Revelations and Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Two of the most cohesive and comprehensive narrative experiences within the entire series. Darby was back. Darby was in charge. And Assassin's Creed actually stood a chance of being good again, at least from a narrative perspective. Against my better judgment, I purchased the collector's edition of Valhalla for £148 after using a Uplay discount. And now, 3 and a bit months later after launch, I've finally completed the game. My name is Doragon, and this is my full review of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Before we get fully into this, I need to say that there is no way to get all of my points or feelings across without entering into spoilers. So please, take this moment as your spoiler warning. If you don't want the game spoiled in any way, add this video to your watch later list. Go away, play the game, and come back once you're done with it. Are you still here? Okay, cool. That means you've either finished the game and you want somebody else's view on it, or spoilers don't bother you. Either way, I'm glad you're here, so let's get into it. Valhalla has a lot of heavy lifting to do. There's an expectation, not only with Darby McDevitt returning, but with Montreal being the lead studio, and with many of the little facts that were announced before launch. Things like the musical talents of Jesper Kyd returning, and all of the coverage seeming to indicate that this game was one for the fans, and one that will be trying to correct a lot of the story and gameplay issues of what had come before. Depending where in the series people dropped off the wagon, and for whatever reasons that may have been, Valhalla's mission statements seem to be bring them all back, and please everyone. It's a balancing act that Assassin's Creed has been attempting to do since the start of the Helix saga. For those that don't know, the Creed is broken up into 3 main eras within the mainline games. You start with the Desmond saga, which are the games where he is alive and the main modern day protagonist. You then get the Helix saga, which went to the first person, the player is the modern day protagonist approach, and ran from Black Flag through to Syndicate. Finally, you have the Layla saga, which are the current crop of games running Origins to Valhalla. Since the start of the Helix saga, the series has attempted to please long-time fans whilst enticing new ones in simultaneously. But it's often stumbled, with only Black Flag and Origins being comprehensive exceptions. That directive, though, has persevered through the series Annus Horribilis in Unity, the Been There Done That of Rogue, the boredom and fatigue of Syndicate, refresh in Origins and disappointment of Odyssey. To then put that expectation on a single title that it can please the old and new fans alike while also bringing in even more new fans is a huge ask. And even with the wealth and depth of talent assigned to this game, could possibly be too much to ask of a single title. I did not enter this game then, expecting it to repair 10 years of mismanagement, cash-ins and abuse of the franchise. Nor did I enter it expecting to like it with only a 2-year turnaround since Odyssey. What I was expecting was steps in a direction that would take the series back towards what I fell in love with, while simultaneously honouring the evolution that it has had in the interim period. I was quietly hopeful, but I entered the game with my expectations appropriately tempered. So let's dive into this. There are as many positives as negatives with this game, and I'm going to talk about them side by side to try and weigh up if one side is worth more than the other, even though the quantity of points might be equal. I may not talk about a positive and then a negative, but I will break this down into segments that will hopefully be well-rounded thoughts. My expectation is that this review is going to be long, so there will be timestamps if you want to jump to a certain section, or if you want to digest it in multiple chunks. Of course, if you want to take it in one fell swoop, you are welcome to do that as well. Whichever way you take this in, I'm very glad that you're doing so. So let's start where I always do. Narrative. Valhalla's story is one aspect that needed to do much of the heavy lifting for the game. Prior to the release of this title, the overarching plot was all over the place, with a lack of narrative direction or cohesion through the series post-Desmond, whichever storylines you were looking at. Excessive liberties had been taken in more recent entries too, that had undermined not just canon lore, but story moments from earlier in the series and the 10 commandments that make an Assassin's Creed game an Assassin's Creed game. With its please everyone mission statement, Valhalla had to address the mess from the titles before, whilst also telling its own story and somehow bringing everything from the series' narratives back together. How on earth would it do that? Well, an Assassin's Creed story is made up of 3 main storyline threads. You have the easiest one to tell, and the one at the forefront of every title in the series, which is the Ancestor or past storyline. You then have the one that should link in with the rest of the series, telling an overarching story that drives the exploration of those memories, which is the modern day. And then there should be that touch of science fiction in the end goal, that furthers the modern day narrative and gives an insight into the precursors, those who came before, or the Isu as they are now known. But these 3 points are only what the story should be built on. They are a foundation for creating a powerful and pleasing whole. There then, of course, needs to be a tale with a beginning, middle and end that complement one another. Characters that you can empathise with, that drive the narrative. Appropriate pacing and tone for the subject matter. In this particular series, an interweaving lore that links in and expands on previous entries. And it should, of course, be of an appropriate and digestible length, not overstaying its welcome. That is what makes a good Assassin's Creed story. It is then the investment payoff of those matters, and the gameplay that it is wrapped up in that can elevate it to the levels of excellence. Due to what had come before, and the engine and design philosophy of Assassin's Creed in this Layla era, Valhalla was backed into a bit of a corner with the story that it almost had to tell to achieve its goals. And hey, credit where it's due. Darby and his team do the absolute best that they can with the slate that they were given. This, of course, doesn't mean that it's an excellent narrative, but as a top-level overview, it does feel like a necessary one in most aspects, with the odd stumble here and there. The modern day story is one of those stumbles, and it feels fairly large. Granted, not just here in Valhalla, but through the whole of the Layla saga. Back in both the Desmond and the Helix eras, we knew roughly why we were diving into the memories of ancestors and what that meant for the overall narrative. We also had meaningful interactions and investigations within the modern world, even way back in the first game. For example, we knew that Desmond was being forced into the Animus to find an artifact that Altair had discovered during the Third Crusade. That turned out to be an Apple of Eden that then showed the locations of many others across the globe. During this, Desmond discovered the ongoing and current conflict of the Assassins versus Templars, alive and well in Rome in 2012. Ezio's first outing was to train Desmond so that he could take on the Templars in the modern day, which he did with great success at the end of that game. Brotherhood was to find the Apple and Temple in Rome that the modern Templars were already after, and get there before they did. Revelations was to heal Desmond's broken mind by concluding the stories of both Altair and Ezio, while obtaining the location of the precursor temple in the US where the team could stop the coming apocalypse. Assassin's Creed 3 had us looking for the key in Connor's memories to stop said apocalypse, and in the interim, retrieving power supplies for the temple and taking out some of the more important Templar agents and cells. All of these modern day stories across 5 games lead from one directly into the next. There were no gaps, no questions, just pure continuity from the moment we meet Desmond to the moment of his sacrifice. Now don't get me wrong, there are aspects here that could have and maybe should have been done better. But you knew what you were doing at all times, why you were doing it, and you were engaged with the past, the present and the precursor stories simultaneously. Because they all had a purpose, they all had stakes, and they interlinked with one another perfectly. All of this, I've written from memory. Yes, it may only be a sentence per game, but the last of those came out in 2012, and I can still regale you with the story beats, overview and lore. Whereas for Layla, a story that only started 4 years ago, I have to go and look it up. It starts well enough in Origins, as this is the first time we've seen Layla. There is little we need to know beyond what is presented as her pretext for being in Egypt and obtaining Bayek's DNA. We learn as we go, as we did in the first game, as to what is happening. After Origins though, Layla's story and journey is disjointed and tough to swallow when it's presented to us. For example, she goes from being a long-time loyal Abstergo employee in Origins, and even stating that she'll never join the Assassin Brotherhood, she's just safer with them for now, to somehow being a fully fledged leader of an assassin cell in Odyssey only 12 months later. And by the way, that's the next time that we interact with this character at all. None of this character development happens or is mentioned in-game, or even in accompanying media. I still don't know what transpired within the 12 months between Origins and Odyssey that got Layla to the point of leading an assassin cell. Especially when some of her cell are the best assassins outside of Desmond. In Odyssey, Layla starts with Cassandra's spear to obtain the DNA from and start reliving Cassandra's memories. But why? We don't know. Nothing is really outlined when entering the Animus. You then don't leave the Animus until the Atlantis storyline is done, which could be hundreds of hours later. As you leave the Animus at the end of that storyline though, you question why Layla comes into contact with the spear. Cassandra is alive, and that spear is not only an Isu weapon just like the staff, but a keepsake of her grandfather, a celebrated character in world history. There is no reason for Cassandra to let go of it and possibly have it fall into the wrong hands, especially before she meets up with Layla, her entire purpose. After meeting Cassandra and obtaining the staff, Layla is corrupted by it less than 10 hours later. She kills her best friend before Otto Berg, a man who left the Templar Order earlier in the series but somehow turns up as a member of the Templar Order to steal the staff from Layla for the Templars. Yeah, the story's erratic in Odyssey, as are Layla's actions and personality. She's merciless in Odyssey's DLC, for example. She paralyzes Berg and leaves him to suffer, an act against the Brotherhood's tenets. She yells, "I'll always be an assassin," in direct contradiction to her statements from just 12 months earlier. She even says that she's going to say goodbye to people in the Animus at the end of the story. something that is impossible according to how an animus works. The character that we were introduced to in Origins feels like they don't appear here in Odyssey, and it almost feels like there's 4 other characters just wearing her avatar. All of this I hate. Yes, it undermines the tenets of Assassin's Creed, but more importantly, it drives us away from a character that we're meant to be connecting with, that is driving this new era of Assassin's Creed stories forward. There's no build-up or explanation to these events beyond because Piece of Eden, meaning it's poorly written and directed, which unfortunately means poorly acted as well. You then face the fact that nearly none of this leads into Valhalla's modern day, other than having the staff and Victoria's death. An entire game's modern day story is wiped from existence. It's not pulled upon in the overarching story and is near enough retconned from canon. Now, I personally do think that Odyssey should be removed from canon. It is a terrible installment in the series. But it's jarring to have it done in this manner, where the narrative team pick and choose what should and what shouldn't be deleted. That being said, the modern day story of Valhalla is okay. I don't think it could have been anything else, given the fact that there's no overarching plot up to this point, and this game is meant to be the end of a trilogy. The reason for the dive into Eivor's memories is available. It's not as explicit as in the Desmond era, but it is available if you search the modern day area. And it does make some sort of sense. An anonymous communication tells the team to find the wolf kissed, as she has the answers. It's not much. Its validity is, of course, questioned, and that's enough. It's a reason to explore Eivor's memories and make sure. Add in the new The World Is Ending story that we've been thrust into. It's explained via news bulletins and podcasts during cutscenes. And it's enough impetus to enter these memories and find something to stop a new apocalypse. We don't need grandiose stories in the modern day all of the time, nor ultra-complex motivations. Some of the best stories in history are built on the simple premise that this one is survival. This stripped-back approach, with minor nods to events in the modern day from all the way back in Assassin's Creed 3, is a great starting point. The narrative team knew they didn't need to add more to engage the player in this particular story. I mean, we've all seen, from the success of the MCU, that the superhero fantasy of save the world is sometimes all of the motivation required to start an epic story. Like in Brotherhood, you can leave the Animus whenever you like in this game. Unlike Brotherhood, however, there's not much reason to do so. I read everything and listened to all of the audio files on Layla's laptop before re-entering the Animus after those initial story beats. Periodically throughout my playtime, I would also jump out of the Animus expecting new updates on things like the state of the world, investigations, emails between Assassin Cell, all that sort of stuff. But there was nothing. There was no change in circumstance between the start and end of the game. The only thing added throughout a playthrough that takes well over 90 hours was the truth videos obtained from the Animus glitches. And this is where the story starts to fall down for me. A beginning, middle and end that complement one another is required to make a cohesive and good story. But the modern day in Valhalla only seems to have that beginning and end. Now, I realise many people will say, but Eivor's story is the middle. But it's not. Eivor's story is part of a greater whole, and has a beginning, middle and end of its own. When there are multiple separate yet complementary stories, such as in Assassin's Creed or, say, Lord of the Rings, they should all have that same structure and be part of a cohesive whole. With the required modern day sections in Valhalla, you literally go from, we need to find out what this message sent us here for, to, Desmond is to blame, let's stop this now we know where to go. I know that's roughly the plot for most Assassin's Creed games in the modern day sections. But here, due to a lack of lead-in, it felt more like it was reaching for a conclusion and was rushed. Which, to be fair, it may well have been. The ending for the modern day is something that I don't know how I feel about. It has a similar flavour to, but less impact than the modern day ending of Assassin's Creed 3. Layla walks into a dangerous situation created by another Isu temple, with the Yggdrasil supercomputer at its heart. She liaises with a sage who is stuck in said supercomputer, the reincarnation of Loki in this case, and stops the apocalypse with his help. She then takes on a new form of existence. Not quite death, but not quite life. And she does this alongside Desmond, who has a new role as the reader, an ethereal entity who reads time and outcomes, nudging humanity towards a favourable path. By the way, that reading of time is the sixth sense of the Isu. It's one factor that I'm not sure on. Yes, this ending makes Desmond relevant again, and sort of states that he has been responsible for the series' direction since 2017. Coupled with the lines from Sean in this game that reality seems to converge on Desmond, it gives him a really important place in the overarching narrative, and doesn't just discard him, like at the end of Assassin's Creed 3. Future stories can also utilise this revelation to fully resurrect Desmond at some point, and give the series the conclusion that was promised to us way back at the start. On the other hand, it opens up the option for worse writers and worse studios such as Ubisoft Quebec to abuse or cast aside a character that has already had a beautiful if tragic story arc. If this is to go anywhere, it needs to be as focused as those first 5 games were, and be consistent in quality and tone throughout. Something that hasn't been repeated since that era. We've also seen stories like this be set up in the past within the series, with the Shroud of Eden, the item that resurrected Jesus, that could have been used on Desmond and ended up actually being used on Juno. But that story got abandoned after Syndicate and sidelined into comics. This is a worry, as the ending of the modern day revives Loki, an Isu in human form, also known as a Sage, reborn via the Idrisil program and released from the supercomputer when Layla entered it and took on a new life. We follow Loki from that point on and control him within the modern day. It's hugely conflicting, as the character has been engaging with us in the memories of Eivor as well, but now so casually takes Layla's place, with no true inkling into his motivations. If this is to be abandoned, just like the Juno story was after years of build-up, we will once again be left with a great story setup that brings no payoff and leaves the brand feeling hollow once more. The modern day story, while having good and even great moments, is only okay as a whole. Its pacing and vast swathes of overlooked or cut content is its biggest drawback, and while I like where it's left to set up what is coming next, I do not have faith that it will go anywhere based on Ubisoft's track record. As I already mentioned, I don't think there was anything they could do to have it be better than okay with the limitations of the rest of the trilogy and the incredibly poor engine that they were working with. In that regard then, it's a triumph. This does feel like a modern day story of old, with payoff, setup and intrigue that will linger and inform the next game. If a different writing team do not take this on board and treat it seriously, or throw it out of the window for a more fantastical approach once more as we saw with Odyssey, this hard work and course correction that we have seen here in Valhalla, to bring a series back on track and set up something big, will have once more been for nothing, and will only serve to drive new and old fans alike away from the series. It's hopeful and positive overall, but as is so often the case with Assassin's Creed, what happens in the next game will show just how good this one's narrative actually is. The bulk of any playthrough in Assassin's Creed is spent within the memories of the Ancestor. In this one, it's Eivor. When we first play as her, we are greeted with a young Eivor before we even get to the modern day story. And within 20 minutes, she succumbs to the tried and true Assassin's Creed protagonist family tragedy that has been with us since Ezio's family. Quick tip, do not be related to an Assassin's Creed protagonist if you wish for your continued survival. Following this moment, we're thrown into the prologue, where we essentially have to escape death and rescue our crew. This serves as a large 2 to 6 hour intro tutorial to the game, mostly going over mechanics and setting up why we moved to England. But during this, one of the biggest criticisms of recent games starts to be addressed, and the hidden ones take a central role. They're actually central to the main plot, while a lot of what they do and the Creed's tenets aren't central to Eivor's developments and are somewhat side factors. The two characters of the hidden ones that you meet, Basim and Hytham, are along for the whole journey and assist you and carry major plot points. especially Basim, as he helps you to whip southern England into shape in search of Sigurd, and eventually reveals himself as Loki. While addressing the fact that Assassins weren't really in the series called Assassin's Creed since 2015, this approach does however come with its own set of drawbacks and concerns. The fact that Eivor doesn't join up with the Brotherhood at any point, which would have been a nice mirror to the character arc of Edward from Black Flag, means they are therefore supporting characters at best. And because this game is broken up into arcs for its storytelling structure that you can tackle in any order, it can be tens of in-game hours and literal real-world days between interactions with the order that this series is named and shaped after. While they are there, and you do essentially function as an assassin through the skills that Basim and Hytham teach you, along with the gift of the Hidden Blade, you are once again an outsider to this conflict that is meant to be so central to the series as a whole. The Ten Commandments of the series explicitly state in point 1 that Assassin's Creed will always tell the story of the secret war between Assassins and Templars. And then point 3 states that the war between Assassins and Templars is the foundation of our franchise story in the past and the present. By therefore being an outsider to the Creed throughout this game, not knowing their drive, tenets and ethos, this war is not the foundation of Valhalla's story, nor is it the core gameplay mechanic. With the addition that Basim is Loki reincarnate, and eventually the driving force behind the narrative, these 2 points are only partially met. Yes, as with the modern day, it's a step in the right direction, but as with the modern day, it feels like it stops just short of making this the central aspect of the title, but wouldn't detract from the rest of it, and would elevate it far beyond the rest of the later trilogy. It gives the impression that the writing team wanted this to be central, that the commandments were paramount to their writing. But the higher-ups wanted to meddle, as they have so often done with Assassin's Creed, and pull it back to a more action, less intrigue, assassin-based game and series. It detracts from a valiant attempt at regaining some of the Assassin's Creed magic, and hurts some of those long-time fans. To have some aspect of it back, however, is a giant leap over what was presented in Odyssey. Eivor's story overall has many a solid moment, and for the majority of its time it is enjoyable. It tells the tale of a person coming to grips with the burdens of leadership and growing within that role. Her advancements and maturity are reflected in the respect that a vast supporting cast offer her, even if the character herself doesn't seem to change that much from our perspective. There are some beautiful arcs that you can play and will play before the end of the main story. My favourite sections were the city arcs, London, Jorvik and Winchester. They had harkbacks to Assassin's Creed 1 and felt the most Assassin's Creed, with integral social stealth and the mystery of discovering who is who before assassinating a target. There are arcs that formed part of the main plot, and these were tightly written, had wonderful storylines that simultaneously were contained and part of the wider narrative, and were brilliantly acted. There are, however, many more regions to ally with or take over than story beats, and due to the power level system, these can only be done in a certain order. What that ends up creating is a pace in the narrative that goes from, say, ultra panic a million mile an hour upon the surrender of Sigurd, to a leisurely 3 mile an hour walk in the park while catching up with old friends up north, celebrating at a funeral, and sleeping with anything that moves. All the while, Sigurd is captured and tortured, and characters have revelations and arcs that seem to come out of nowhere. It almost reminds me of The Last of Us Part 2, and the issues that I personally had with that particular game. I think The Last of Us is a masterpiece, and that the story is superb. But I think that the manner in which it is presented to us breaks the story flow and player engagement. You're building to a crescendo, and then suddenly out of nowhere you have to start again from scratch as a different character halfway through the game. That feeling of the brakes being slammed on and a distraction being dangled in front of you is exactly what Valhalla's pacing feels like on more than one occasion. The ebb and flow of pace for both narrative development and character development is disorienting and on occasion completely aggravating. It almost prevented me from finishing the game. I got to the 60-hour mark and hit a brick wall. and of a game that lasts over 100 hours for credits to roll, that's not a positive thing. And that statement brings me to my biggest story gripe. Valhalla is far too long, and long outlasts its welcome. I had 3 titles in 2020 that were up for my personal Game of the Year choice. They were The Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima, and Spider-Man Miles Morales. My cumulative playtime to roll credits on all 3 of these games was 81 hours. 3 games with different stories, different art aesthetics, different characters and gameplay, different engaging experiences. They told their story in a time frame that didn't leave you needing more, but did leave you wanting more. By contrast, at that same hour mark in Valhalla of 81, I was simply willing the game to end, as I was no longer having fun and wanted a variation in experience. Yet it kept going. Some of this is from a gameplay design perspective, and I will touch on that more later. But the stories in this world all form part of one narrative whole. There aren't the cool side quests like Fires of Dionysus or Leonardo's inventions from Origins and Brotherhood that are their own self-contained thing that can either be completely missed or happily stumbled upon. Nor are there the overwhelming quantity of fetch quests from Odyssey that tell their own individual stories no matter how samey they may be. Everything is a fleshed out story arc that can last anywhere from 2 to 6 hours in Valhalla, or even longer if you're trophy hunting and complete everything within a region on your first travel there. Yes, there are mini side quests called mysteries that have mini stories within them and show that the world is a little broader than your all-conquering quest. But these last a maximum of 10 minutes each, and then they're done. Any meaningful story is fully fleshed out and presented as a region arc. While I wholeheartedly appreciate the world building and characterization that this approach does allow, I personally feel that it should have been streamlined and presented in a much more focused approach. I realise with the overwhelming size of the map, the scope and design of the game, and the regions that were in it, that this wasn't fully possible. However, there are many in-between quests that don't add to the story arcs and are solely there as padding. There's one where you're running after a friend for 1,500 meters in total silence, to then have a pre-rendered cutscene behind a waterfall. The whole gameplay section of that could have been cut and just presented as the cutscene. It would have had the same impact, would have cut quite a chunk of bloat from the game, and would not have detracted from the story at all. It feels like certain arcs were simply trying to meet a timing quota. Essex, for example. Every quest was across the complete opposite side of the county, and many of these quests were then a follow a character to another location while idly chatting. When that one county is bigger than Rome from Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, you quickly realise that this entire arc, that could actually be enjoyable from a solely story perspective, is mostly padding. And when this is a latter game arc, there is no excuse other than Ubisoft's new engagement parameters that they use to show how good their games are at the moment. If what you measure how good a game is by how long people spend in it, not only is that a poor reflection of how the community actually feel, it also means that the story will be written to meet a time quota. Gameplay design will be made to meet a time quota to drive up that level of time engagement, even if that story segment would be vastly improved for being a good chunk shorter. It's a shame. And it's Ubisoft meddling in story beats once again because this is what they think drives positive growth in the industry, and it's not. Anyhow, the main crux of the story before you're pulled out of the Animus centres around Sigurd, Eivor and Basim as the reincarnated Tyr, Odin and Loki, respectively. To understand this story properly, you need to finish the mythological arcs and unlock all of the truth fragments from the Animus anomalies. This I love. While I accept the point that many people won't do this before the end of the game, and the ending may therefore not make sense when played and be disappointing, for the old hats of Assassin's Creed like me, it's nigh on perfect. The best stories and lore in this world are not always the ones presented to you in the central narrative. It's the ones that you have to work for, seek out and complete through non-standard gameplay. The truth from Assassin's Creed 2, 16's message from Brotherhood, the real ending from Liberation. These add so much to the story of the Isu and Assassins alike, and to have them be part of the gameplay loop again, rather than a soliloquy in a temple location such as in Origins, is massively satisfying. It is actually these complementary stories that kept me going through that wall that presented itself to me at the 60-hour mark, and allowed me to finish the narrative of this game. The intrigue and theories that my partner and I were creating whilst unlocking this information made me realise that this is what Assassin's Creed is actually about. Figuring out the stories for yourself, having them confirmed or denied in-game, and then nerding all over the floor thereafter. If you have all of the information available to you, whilst predictable, the first ending of the Ancestor memories is incredibly rewarding and a worthy payoff for the effort that you have put in. Do not get me wrong, there are some major questions as to how three sages can be reborn at exactly the same time in history and come into such close proximity with one another when done so. We see through the sages encountered elsewhere in the series that their rebirth is completely random, some being born again and again, and others only being reborn once. We also see that the success of their old memories coming back can go from nothing to everything. That battle for control of the mind of a sage, however, is highlighted brilliantly in Eivor's character. Odin appears as a separate entity occupying the same mind space and tries to guide Eivor's hand to open the door for him to return fully throughout the entire narrative. Eivor, however, rejects Odin and banishes him at the end of the main campaign, living her life free and as herself, whereas Sigurd is a mixture of Tyr and himself at this point, and Loki has completely taken over Basim. It's an interesting dynamic, and one that unfortunately doesn't get the space or time to grow and expand, with Eivor trapping Basim in Yggdrasil, and she and Sigurd returning to their Viking ways before Layla is pulled out of the Animus. Whilst that is a shame, the modern day ending offers scope to explore this sage dynamic more in future installments, and does cut a bit of length from an already overstuffed game. As with all Assassin's Creed games, you can jump back into the Animus to polish up the final bits once the story is done. But with Valhalla, this plays out as some form of epilogue with new story content and Order of the Ancients members to chase down. This story after the fact felt odd. The end goal of the modern day, the driving force behind these games, was done. We had a different modern day character filling the role of protagonist, and while diving into the Animus for a mop-up would be fine, what is the point of having more story after the fact? Especially some of the biggest payoffs. It felt like this epilogue was meant to be before the Eivor Sigurd Basim showdown, and the kicker of Basim/Loki taking over as modern day protagonist. And possibly the antagonist moving forward was meant to be the cliffhanger on which we left. I would have liked that and enjoyed it much more than what we actually got. The situation as it stands, the story of Eivor just sort of ends. There's no definitive jumping off point, no revelation or conclusion, just ending for the sake of ending. And it left me in a really weird place once it was all said and done. When all said and done though, Valhalla set itself lofty goals to please so many disparate parts of the Assassin's Creed community. The story was one of the biggest points of contention in more recent games, alienating those who'd been around for a long time, while keeping newcomers completely in the dark over series nods offered throughout the narrative threads. Valhalla does a lot to bring people fully into the fold, regardless of their jumping on point with the series. While there are concerns about the presentation and pacing of the story, and some of the characterization, it is overall good and likeable to an old hat AC fan such as myself. With trimming and cutting of bloat, a vastly improved system and engine to tell the story through, and a better measurement of player satisfaction than time engagement, the possible stories that this franchise can tell moving forward, towards a hopeful definitive end, could actually place it back atop the roster as king of all franchises. From a mechanics, design, and implementation perspective, this game is a mess. It is such a crying shame to say, as more often than not I do find myself actually wanting to play it and either just have fun in the world or uncover more intrigue. But it feels like everything isn't quite implemented right. And I do mean everything. From simple things like Eivor not climbing when told, assets being in 12 frames per second, no time frame outline for events in-game, the illusion of choice and multiple controls assigned to the same buttons, through to physically transparent characters, really poor free-running systems, flying boats, invisible enemies, patches that break more than they fix, a list of bugs longer than my street, and getting stuck on rocks, weeds, and flies. This game is infuriating to play from the very moment that you start to the moment that you finish, and the feeling of putting down the controller and knowing that you never have to pick it back up to play this game, due to your story investment, is so freeing. But that's never how a game should leave you feeling. As gaming hardware advances, or teams become more familiar with the current generation, you should see advancements in games. Some are instantly noticeable, like graphics, whereas others you may only notice when you go to another game that doesn't have them, like accessibility options, loading times, or advanced movement mechanics. Valhalla is a release for the final full year of the PS4 and Xbox One console generation, where they are the pinnacle home console devices, much like Black Flag was for the PS3 and Xbox 360. This should therefore be the best game that Ubisoft have turned out this generation. I should not, then, be booting up a game from a development team that has been working on this hardware for 8 or 9 years, with additional next-gen enhancements when playing on next-gen as I was, and be longing for an engine and systems from 14 years ago. But here we are in 2021, and I can hand on heart say that the original Assassin's Creed handles better than Valhalla, and the contest isn't even close. For a bit of clarity, this statement isn't just in relation to the likes of parkour. It is every mechanic in the game. Stealth, social stealth, open combat, climbing, parkour, menus, cutscenes, confession rooms, item interaction. Any time that there is a player input, you can put the two games side by side, and every single occasion, I would choose Assassin's Creed over Valhalla. The worst part about this feeling, though, is that I can't even tell you definitively why the mechanics are this bad. This is the same engine that was used on Origins in 2017, a game that I adore and that sits behind only Brotherhood in my ranking of Assassin's Creed titles. It was tightly polished and handled superbly on the original PS4. Climbing, though dumbed down drastically from other series titles like Unity and a far cry from the Ezio trilogy, was precise and didn't feel like a chore to complete. Combat, while riffing on the Demon's Souls formula, was fun. Yes, it was a little over the top. Yes, it had too many perks and fantasy elements in a series that has always thrived on real-world history and science fiction. But again, it was well built and performed well. Origins felt good in 2017 and still feels quite good today. So what is wrong with Valhalla? Part of the issue, I imagine, is size. Since Unity, Assassin's Creed has been growing to ridiculous sizes, with 1-to-1 scale buildings and expanding maps. This game's map, for example, is over 140 kilometers square, which often means that your next quest is way over 4,000 meters away, no matter where you are. Compare that to rarely being more than 2,000 meters away from a new quest in Origins, and you start to see how the underlying engine is stretched in size alone. This game renders in 4K and tries to aim for 60 FPS on a regular basis, whereas Origins was 1080-30 on the base PS4. Now do get me wrong, it can render in 4K, but that was only on the One X console. Valhalla has vastly more inputs and overlapping controls than Origins, which tended to assign one action to one button. And Ubisoft has a practice in-house of reusing engines for at least 3 iterations of a franchise. In times gone by, such as the Ezio trilogy for example, this was fine. Assets were nigh on the same game to game, and the size of each installment wasn't as drastic a change as going from Origins to Odyssey to Valhalla. Take into account that the engine utilised for Origins was showing signs of age when it was released in 2017. By 2020 it's just completely outclassed and everything feels old. Because of the stretched nature of the engine and what Valhalla is actually trying to do from a gameplay perspective, and add in the probability of launching before it was ready just to meet the demands of Ubisoft executives, it becomes apparent that Valhalla should not have released when it did. At a conservative guess, I'd say it probably launched a year too early. When playing the game, it just feels rushed. It feels like everything is in an initial playable state, and it's not yet had that required level of polish. But rather than getting said level of polish, it was just released instead. I mean, let's look at a few more precise things. Climbing is awful. Notice how I don't say parkour? Because it doesn't exist in this game. Instead, you have climbing and jumping mechanics, which is okay, but it does go a little against another of the 10 commandments. Number 4, the assassin should always be agile, socially skilled, unbeatable with a blade, and a stylish badass. There can be arguments made for this point in the game, and I would agree with many of them. But the first word about what the assassin should be is agile. And Eivor feels like an oversized vehicle in every situation. Now in some scenarios, such as open combat, this is great. I want to feel weighty and brutal when fighting openly. But when it comes to movement and stealth for which movement is a big factor, she feels like a tractor-trailer combo, and with the turning circle of the QE2. This means that the climbing feels clunky, imprecise, and even difficult to pull off. When coupled with that distinct lack of polish, there is just no consistency to what Eivor will climb and what she won't. I've had my Eivor stumped by pebbles in the road and be completely unable to move, but she can leap up a sheer extreme difficulty rock face like Spider-Man. She'll argue against climbing through a window when you want her to, but launch through them with reckless abandon when you're trying to climb past and be sneaky. Overhangs are a skill she only sometimes knows, and obvious handholds are not as obvious as they obviously are. Then add in the fact that you don't have the free-running abilities of earlier games in the series, with skills like wall eject, climb cancel and so on missing, and some aspects of the world just become completely inaccessible, even though they've been very easily accessible before. This struggle translates into all aspects of movement. Vaulting over waist-level items is oddly missing here, and Eivor will climb atop every single fence, rock, cart or other waist-level obstruction that you come across. I don't remember this being an issue in either Origins or Odyssey, but then they probably don't have the abundance of fences that we Brits do, so hey, who knows. Running and swimming, they just don't feel agile. They're laborious, and I often find myself choosing to fast travel ahead of running there myself, even if it's only a few hundred meters, simply because the experience of movement in this game just isn't engaging or fun. It's a big problem, and in a game series that has built itself and its identity on an enjoyable freedom of movement across an open world, it's a long way to fall. Especially when other games now do the open world traversal so well that you never use their fast travel systems. Stealth is a bit more of a mixed bag. The return of guaranteed assassinations when you drive a blade into someone's jugular, that does much of the work here. Removing that core gameplay mechanic that had been in the series from the start in Odyssey was one of its bigger sins amidst the catastrophe that was that game. So to have it back feels wonderful, even though it should never have been missing in the first place. When you do sneak up on someone and perform a silent assassination, it feels so unbelievably rewarding, especially when you can choose the difficulty of stealth separately to the difficulty of combat and such, and you know I cranked mine up. The problem comes in actually getting to that point, because as mentioned earlier, Stealth is often based a lot on movement. Movement is janky in this game, and you'll often find that a beautifully planned approach will fail because, well, reasons. I've snuck into areas, fallen off the middle of a flat roof, and landed amongst 6 guards. I've tried to assassinate for Eivor to jump in completely the wrong direction or swing her sword instead of her hidden blade. I've had animations start and then nothing happens, or a small bump on the ground prevent the assassination completing. Now people will look at my button complaint and say, hey, you can reassign buttons, just put assassinate somewhere else. I mean, yeah, that's fine. It is a workaround. But I paid £148 for this game. I should not be doing this work then for the developers. It should be a finished and polished product straight out of the box. To have to go in and sort this out myself so that my experience isn't hampered just shows this game's shoddy design, and it negatively impacts the player experience. Combat, on the other hand, is okay. Thankfully, we've dropped the damage sponge ethos from Odyssey, which meant that even grunts took minutes to take down. And we've returned to a little bit more realism, where 3 to 4 strikes will kill most enemies. I'm not a huge fan of the combat, as serviceable as it is, as it's all animation based, meaning that I can start a heavy attack, notice that I need to dodge or block an incoming one, and then be completely helpless because the animation for my heavy has already started and it must complete its course before I can then do anything else. This whole animation is everything idea has hampered the series somewhat since Assassin's Creed 3, and the development team lean into it more and more with each iteration. If it continues at the rate that it's going, we'll soon just press a button and combat will happen with no further player input, similar to horse riding or sailing currently. Because hey, why should we be engaged and have autonomy about how we approach and handle a situation? It's a far cry from the likes of Brotherhood, where I felt combat was at its peak. You were fast, fluid and agile in your movements in that game, and could cancel an in-action attack to block one that was incoming, before then continuing a chain kill. Despite its simplistic visuals, there were layers of complexity and precision to the Brotherhood combat. To be able to pull off some stunning moves while decimating an entire army, but one wrong move and your health was disappearing fast, was rewarding. Valhalla has walked so far from that peak that it's now walking the desert plains and can't even see said peak in the distance. As cool as the kill animations in Valhalla are, by the 6th or 7th time of seeing a pike rammed down someone's throat, or someone beaten with the flat of a greatsword, you just want to get back into the gameplay and fight for yourself, but you're stuck in yet another over-the-top animation that is rolled out so often in combat that it loses all its specialness. Revelations had slow-motion kill animations. They actually happened in most fights, but they only occurred when there were no other enemies left. They were a cool, I've just wiped out X amount of foes statement piece, and they didn't break that combat flow. Funky and cool animations do have a place in the series' combat. Assassin's Creed 3, while introducing what is now a bit of a problem, actually balanced it quite well and used those animations to take out multiple foes at once while looking really cool doing it. But Valhalla's animations, they only ever take out a single enemy, and the time that they take up, especially when popped out on every other enemy type, once again just feels like gameplay padding. The combat is serviceable overall, and let's be honest, after the massive number spam that we had in Odyssey, serviceable is actually a big step forward in spite of my complaints. Now, if I'm looking at skills and management systems, there's nothing wrong here, except of course for the thing that we do keep coming back to, the engine. The systems work well enough. There's a couple of missing aspects, like previewing items and such, but there's nothing broken about the systems from a mechanical point of view. It's just that they feel ancient. You can tell you're playing an old engine in every aspect of this game, and things like the UI, even on next-gen systems with their super fast SSDs, GPUs and CPUs, they feel clunky. I mean, credit to the team that built these aspects though, they work, they do their job well. And while they come in many different shapes, every single one does what it was designed to, even if it is a bit slow or clunky due to that engine. It's such a shame, isn't it? It's so easy to talk about the negatives because you can easily see one route that it could have been done better. The same is true for something like an overwhelming positive. I could wax lyrical for hours about Ghost of Tsushima or God of War, for example, because there's so many positives to talk about. But when things just do their job, and not even to a high level of polish because none of this game seemed to get that, you can't really say more than they work. And when I consider that for me, mechanically, menus, skill trees, shops, customizations and such are the highlight of this game, and the best I can say is they work, it's a bit of a sad indictment for the rest of the title's mechanics. As I said at the start of this sector, mechanically this game is a mess. And that's without going into the bugs that riddle this title. There is fun to be had here, but more often than not, you're hampered by these poor systems that your fun is just overruled by frustration. Design, meanwhile, can be a subjective view. What one person thinks is good design, another may think is bad. This sort of variation in viewpoint, however, often comes from a finishing or aesthetic standpoint. I don't like the lens flare in that scene, for example, or that toilet is in the wrong place in the room. There are, however, design choices that no one can deny are incorrect, like plug sockets beside a shower, a driving position that's angled rather than straight, or a 16:9 aspect ratio screen on a mobile phone above 6 inches. These are the design language that mean that whatever the product is, it can be used as intended without additional allowances having to be made by the user. When it comes to things like Assassin's Creed, or any long-running series for that matter, there is then the added design expectation to match, honour and improve upon what has come earlier in the series. Games also require a design language that makes the finished product engaging. Whether that be from a fun, story or thought-provoking engagement, whatever that choice, it needs to keep the player playing until the end. If one aspect doesn't meet the design brief, whether that be gameplay, story, visuals, acting and so on, the whole thing will fall apart. The best design may well change multiple times throughout the creation process, and for a project the size of Valhalla, have thousands of little amendments to ensure that the title stays cohesive and the overarching vision remains intact. This is how the technological world works. This is how engineering, construction, and even things like teaching and logistics work, among others. Valhalla brings some questionable design choices to the table, and some of these are core to the design philosophy, so have a massive impact upon the game design as a whole. Most of the questionable choices, however, are minor. They can be immersion breaking, sure, but they're not game breaking. The ones that keep springing to mind are things like the low frame rate assets. Now, I played on next gen, and I chose performance mode when playing, which targets 60 frames a second over quality. Throughout my playthrough, however, I kept noticing assets that were way below 60 FPS. So far below that even when I switched back to resolution mode, which targets quality over frame rate, so locks you at 30 FPS, these assets were still of an oddly low frame rate even there. It was things like flags, birds, drapes, capes, water splashes, and even the odd person, all at what appeared to be 12 frames per second. And this isn't a bug. Every time you came across these assets in-game, they were all 12 FPS. With it being such a drastic difference between the normal 60 that I was playing at and the assets 12, you notice them really harshly every single time that one pops on screen, and it just destroys all sense of immersion that you had. Visually, however, I can say that the design is brilliant. It encapsulates an era of transition in Britain from the Roman Empire through to the Dark Ages really well, and offering it as an interactive playground is great because we've only had access to that sort of era through books, documentaries or archaeological maps previously. The team took the time to recreate an authentic England from the turn of the previous millennium, which to be fair is something that they've always excelled at throughout the entire Assassin's Creed series. The weaponry, while samey within the same category, looks authentic to era designs, if, you know, a little bit more robust. Clothing and armour of the main characters are really detailed, though more time has obviously been put into the microtransaction armour sets than those included in a £148 game. Character models are the best they've ever looked, and Eivor actually looks better in-game than in promotional material, which is a first for the Assassin's Creed series. Even the English fauna looks great. I know this because I got run over by a deer in a cutscene and got a really nice close-up look of him. Really impressive. though it did sort of make things a little bit weird with Eivor just talking while lying on her back out of shot. That does sort of show that cutscenes aren't a good design choice in this game. We get so much story through the camera flip cutscene we became all too accustomed to in Odyssey, where the character model stands stock still, gesticulates in exactly the same way constantly, and the voice tries to do all of the work. The open world can also interfere in these cutscenes, as it did with me on multiple occasions. All of this detracts from the content the scene is trying to portray. When we do then get a full motion capped cutscene, which, to be fair, are much more prevalent in this game over Odyssey, it only serves to show up these others as really poorly done. I think this is a little bit compounded by the massive but flat open world, as beautiful as it is. You often hear that games can be wide and shallow, but Valhalla actually takes that to a physical level as well. The England that is available to you is just completely flat. There are single story huts that you can climb, sure, and the city arcs do offer a more classic approach to the Assassin's Creed experience. But the rest of the time, you could just as well be playing any other open world game. This world is massive, flat, and empty. There is nothing to do outside of the coloured markers on the map, removing player autonomy once again and killing the open world exploration. When a linear title like The Last of Us Part 2 does exploration better than your open world title, something in the basic design philosophy of your game needs to give. There is so much empty time that is just there with no purpose. You then rock up at a location and have a stationary cutscene, as outlined previously. It's just boring, and it negatively impacts the story because of poor or lazy design once again. This impact on the story is made worse by the decision to only put dates on the first and last mission. Like, when are we in Eivor's life here? When do these events happen? The best Assassin's Creed titles have a tight timeline and display the passage of time within these cards on cutscenes, sequences, or mission start screens. Valhalla does none of this. It's a strange decision that leaves you feeling lost in time, that only seems to have been implemented since Odyssey. I did think that there was hope in the setup of the Order of the Ancients aspect of the game. I do personally love this particular aspect. Its initial design, concept, and implementation work really well. For some reason though, whoever designed the Ancients menu didn't think that the entire premise of this aspect of the game should stretch into the silhouettes of the members of the Order. And they made it so that you could see who the members were long before uncovering all of the clues as to their identity. This choice deadened and detracted from massive story beats and revelations, and the payoff thereafter in multiple different story arcs. Like over 40 hours from the end of the game, and the story revelation that King Alfred was the leader of the Order, I knew it was him because of the silhouette. Ubisoft are spoiling their own game with in-game design choices. All this disappointment from a simple poor design choice and implementation of a system that otherwise works. As I said earlier, most of these are minor, and they don't stop you from playing the game because it won't go any further. It might stop you playing because you're a little annoyed, but they're not game-breaking. There are, however, two big issues. Two big game and player-breaking issues. Bugs and microtransactions. Bugs are a hot topic in gaming at the moment. Cyberpunk 2077 was a breaking point for the entire gaming community, finally pushing us over the edge after years of being subject to unfinished bug-riddled games. Somehow, in all of that anger, Assassin's Creed Valhalla escaped the vitriol despite being almost as bad as Cyberpunk. This game is riddled with bugs, more than even in this massive video I can mention. A few are just annoying, like Eivor suddenly becoming transparent, or certain fish not spawning so a trophy can't be achieved. But for many, the vast majority of the bugs are game impacting at least, and game breaking at worst. There is a list on the Ubisoft blog right now of known issues that have fixes incoming. It is a solid 8 to 10 minute read of bullet pointed bugs. If you pop on over to Reddit, you can then find further common bugs that aren't yet on that list of Ubisoft's. Consider as well that the last two title updates have added more niggles, bugs, and game crashing scenarios, and it gives you a taste of just how big a mess Valhalla is. There is no excuse for a game from a AAA developer that costs £148 at its top end to be this big of a mess. Every other minute there is another bug, another poor design decision, another poorly implemented process or system that it just constantly detracts from anything else that you're doing in game. There were times that I felt that this game was hanging by a thread, and an overzealous swing of a sword may just cause it to crash. And lo and behold, it did. It's unacceptable. But somehow Ubisoft are getting away with it year upon year, franchise upon franchise. And it needs to stop. It comes down to us, the consumer, to hold them accountable for it. By far the worst aspect, though, is the microtransactions. Any game that utilises microtransactions has to take them into account at every phase of design, from concept to completion. That means that there are aspects of the game that are made differently because microtransactions are involved. If you happen to think that that's not the case, have a look at the Sparrow and Ghost Shell economy in Destiny 2 compared to the one in Destiny, or the shader controversy at the launch of Destiny 2, or the fact that there are now weapons locked behind a further paywall of a season pass. Adding in those microtransactions fundamentally changed how the next Destiny game was made and where the best looking and most useful loot came from. It was, and to a big degree still is the case, that it's no longer from top-end gameplay. When you think back on what the best parts of the Assassin's Creed franchise are, many people will mention the assassin tombs from AC2 and the armour of Altair that then comes from it. This was integral to the game and story, as Ezio is wearing that armour at the start of Brotherhood. It is so well remembered because of the gameplay leading up to the best looking and most useful outfit in the game. You had to earn it, and it was rewarding when you did. Take Odyssey or Valhalla though, and the best looking and best performing armour sets are all in the store. To buy them, you have to spend an additional £15 per outfit. When the best design is going into the store items, it isn't then going into the main game. When there are more sets of store armour than in-game armour, that design and talent isn't going into the main game. When there is no gameplay loop to obtain the best looking and best performing armour, player engagement has actively been removed from the game in favour of microtransactions. When that player engagement is removed, story beats that would otherwise come from said gameplay loop are lost, or maybe shoehorned into uninteresting side content. You then have to take into account the real money, purchasable XP boosters in both of these games. What would be the reason that you feel the need to sell an XP booster for your game? If you have designed your game well and balanced it appropriately, the XP and level curve should be engaging in and of itself. When you then add a story and mechanics atop of it, and you can see yourself improving, it should lead to meaningful growth and engagement within the game world. At no point should a well-designed system need a purchasable boost. Yet Odyssey had it available from launch in the store, and Valhalla introduced a boost into their store at their first title update around a month after launch. All of that states is that the game was purposely made to be just that little bit unbalanced against the player, that it may force their hand to purchase said boosts and keep playing because they're already invested in the game. It's underhanded money-making tactics at the detriment of game design. It's a poison on any franchise. But for a series that used to pride itself on lore, player engagement, in-game secrets and rewards for said secrets, to have so much of its reward content put behind a further paywall, and the removal of the gameplay content that those rewards came from, just burns that little bit more. This game is broken in so many ways, but some of those are so fundamental to the Ubisoft concept and the homogenizing of franchises that even if Valhalla got 60 title updates, it cannot improve the game because the core design is completely warped and cannot be undone at this point. It's so annoying because the story could be enough if only the gameplay were fine. Instead, it's poorly designed, badly implemented, and even undermined at every turn. And it just coalesces to mean that I actually hate the feel of playing this game. The easiest question to answer for this game is probably the most important. Is it an Assassin's Creed game? Thankfully, Ubisoft themselves have provided us with the 10 commandments that must be adhered to make an Assassin's Creed title. So, let's quickfire through them and try and answer this all-important question. Number 1. Assassin's Creed will always tell the story of the secret war between assassins and Templars. Not really. While there is an assassin story here, and the conclusion of the Order of the Ancients aspect of the game hints at Alfred creating the Templar Order, none of the Order of the Ancients stuff is required to complete the game. You can save it all until after the modern day ending if you wish, and it has no bearing on the title or story. Therefore, no. Point 1 is not met. 2. Being an assassin doesn't make the main character a ruthless killer. He kills, but he has principles and never murders innocents. He avoids collateral damage as much as possible. Hello, River Raids content drop. Hello, Viking pillaging. Yeah. Badly missed that one. 3. The war between assassins and Templars is the foundation of our franchise story in the past and present. It's optional here in the past, and the present focuses on the end of the world. Templars aren't even mentioned until Basim brings them up right at the very end. Therefore, it's not the foundation, it's an afterthought. So again, no. This isn't met. 4. The assassin should always be agile, socially skilled, unbeatable with a blade, and a stylish badass. I sort of covered this one in the mechanics section, but Eivor is not agile. She's an utter tank and handles like a massive cruise liner. But she does meet the other aspects, even if they're not always to my taste. So I'm going to give it this one. Yeah, point met. 5. Pivotal moments in human history are the basis of our franchise. Assassin's Creed will always take a revisionist approach on real events. We'll use historical gaps to create our story. This period in English history is basically just one big gap. We have flashes of information and records on a few of the big moments, but overall it's an empty slate, and the team have free rein to tell whatever sort of story they want. So yeah, overall, this one meets the criteria. 6. History should always be portrayed as relevant to our core audience, with facts that tie into present-day common knowledge and edgy modern art direction. I'm not sure what relevance this story has to the audience other than, yay, Vikings! There's no commentary on the state of the real world, and anything that could possibly be edgy is neutered. Picking of the character, for example, why is this even an option? Is it to make sure that you don't lose the sexist sector of the purchase base? How is that edgy? Edgy is going against the grain and the evil that has too much power. This title does none of that. So missed criteria again. 7. Assassin's Creed is based on technology. Nothing is magical. Everything has a plausible technological explanation. For many hours of this game, I was willing to say that this was spot on. But then you come to the Daughters of Lyron, a talking white stag, 3 mythological arcs where you play as the Norse god Odin alongside the Norse pantheon, Basim being over 1,000 years old, and a good few abilities that are a little bit more than human. There is some good work done within the script to say that this is how Eivor's eyes perceived the technology and memories so that her brain could make sense of it. But then we have a fully fledged technological Isu temple with none of the magic filters on it at the end of the game. This design choice was done to please and entice a player base that wants a fantasy game instead of an open world action mystery game that AC built itself on, and it undermines the creed. Missed criteria. 8. Assassin's Creed is about digging in a character's past through their DNA in order to understand what really happened in key historical moments. Yeah, pretty much. Finally. There's a reason to us digging through Eivor's memories, though it's not explained why we have to relive so much of her life as we had outlined to us in the Desmond era. Is it because she's not Layla's genetic ancestor? Is it because Layla doesn't have Isu DNA? It's met, but I would like to see it taken a little further. But overall, well done. 9. Since the player relives the deeds of his kin through his DNA, the IP cannot be set in the future. DNA of unborn people does not exist. Look, even Odyssey got this one right. So I'd be shocked if a game trying to correct that game's mistakes stepped into the future and got this wrong. Criteria met. 10. Assassin's Creed can bend historical accuracy, but cannot create a Uchronia. A Uchronia is a completely different history and therefore a disparate and new timeline. Valhalla sticks true to the history that we do know of the era, as little as that is. So, criteria met. That's 5 out of the 10 commandments that have been met by this game. Granted, 2 of those are stretching the bounds of the wording in the commandment a little bit, but we'll give it to it. But that means that we're halfway there. But it also means it's halfway not Assassin's Creed. Like everything else in this title, it's a job half done. Halfway Assassin's Creed. Half finished, half baked, half polished, half arsed. Everything in Valhalla is a half measure, and I paid £148 for this half-arsed game. That amount of money should never be underappreciated. It's 3 and a bit days of work here in the UK. It's superb, short-term money-making tactics from Ubisoft. But it is a really poor customer experience and satisfaction. Ubisoft created Assassin's Creed. They also recreated Prince of Persia, licensed Tom Clancy's entire works, made Splinter Cell the actual stealth game that Metal Gear Solid wished it were at the time, and brought the world beyond good and evil. This is a developer that, once upon a time, pushed new, weird, unique and tightly honed gaming experiences. But in the past decade, they've not really innovated at all, and instead followed the industry trends rather than setting them. In the past 18 months specifically, they have also been their own public enemy number 1, with executives, producers, directors and all spaces around and above have been outed for their sexist, racist and bigoted ways. These archaic mindsets filtered down into all franchises and releases, with the demands of these higher-ups having to be met. One producer, who shall remain nameless to not give them publicity, was recorded saying that Assassin's Creed can only ever have a cis-white male protagonist or he'll start firing people. Let's not tell him that the series launched with a Middle Eastern protagonist then, eh? The fact that these sort of changes and directives have been implemented across every single Ubisoft IP shows that whatever changes happened in executive personnel had a direct impact on the design structure of everything made by Ubisoft. Money became the bottom line. I realise they are a business and that money is always the bottom line, but it became the primary concern, the only concern. And as we spoke about with microtransactions, when that happens, it changes the way that you make a game. Focus groups become the driving factor behind your creation process, and anything considered risky or new is often squashed because it doesn't fit the narrow view field of what is popular in this moment. You start looking externally at what is working elsewhere and try to implement that into your titles, even if, say, an RPG system doesn't fit a tight narrative that you have built. What this leads to is every release that has these factors added in as part of a company directive to feel samey. And as releases keep coming and these directives stay in place, it leads every IP to feel generic. That feeling reached saturation in 2019 after the latest Ghost Recon was lambasted in reviews from both media and fans alike. This led Ubisoft to delay many titles to make them the best that they could possibly be. But when Watch Dogs Legion, Roller Champions, Hyperscape and Assassin's Creed all launch or have betas and early access in 2020 and feel just as generic as before those delays, you start to wonder if Ubisoft can actually right this sinking ship. Right now, my biggest problem and concern with the Assassin's Creed series is Ubisoft. For all of their high-profile firings and reorganisation, For all of their bravado of positive change and better times incoming, by February 2021, we've seen no changes, had no updates, and the shady practices are persevering, and if anything, getting worse. Just look at the microtransactions now being reskins of in-game armor for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I hope that Ubisoft can turn this around. I hope that the next 12 months are a rebuilding process for them, and they can bring in new talent, new leadership, and put the right sort of people in the right places for the right franchises. If they do manage to do such a thing, there is hope and there is possibility that future Assassin's Creed titles will spark a level of joy in myself that they've not done for at least the last 6 or 7 years. But this is another one that only time will tell. So when revisiting this in the future, hopefully this now means a whole heap of nothing. When I started this review, I honestly thought that I mostly liked Valhalla. The bugs and poor implementation prevented me from saying definitively, and I could straight up say that the game is not worth full price for that exact reason. It's just not finished. But I thought that the solid story beats that gave me those little moments of spiked endorphins would overrule that feeling once the game was fixed. Returning to the game to capture video for this review, and to play new content drops while looking at it through a critical lens, those feelings began to change drastically. When I was then writing about them as well, I realised that the weight of positivity was far outweighed by the negativity. The positives that gave me those jump out of my seat moments and punch the air in jubilation were there to fill new areas of the Wikipedia page and make the franchise look deeper than it has actually become. Most of those moments that I speak about are relegated to optional content, things like the optional mythical arcs, the codex in the optional Hidden Ones bureaus, or an optional area in North America. None of those amazing moments that really hit home for me are central to this game at all. Assassin's Creed used to be the industry leaders, its innovation and stories copied by the rest of the industry. But somewhere in the last 14 years that changed, and Ubisoft started copying everybody else rather than being unique and doing their own thing that had served them so well previously, and put not just Assassin's Creed, but most Ubisoft titles at the pinnacle of the industry. With rushed releases and poor management, pressure and directives from executives, and a homogenizing of every franchise under the Ubisoft umbrella, Assassin's Creed has been hampered by internal demands and a misunderstanding of the core fanbase for over a decade now. That doesn't change with Valhalla. For all the talk of a positive company change to bring better representation, better games, better understanding of the fans, alongside their big shouts of stamping out racism, bigotry and misogyny within Ubisoft's higher management and games, nothing has materialised. After the launch of Valhalla, we still see overwhelming male Eivor marketing at the canon female Eivor's expense. New stories with female main characters are being relegated to books, and this particular one is an Eastern character that fans have been crying for a full game of since Revelations. The after-launch content does not have the Valhalla team involved, and Darby was not part of the writing team for the DLC. What we've received so far are a one-and-done party game and a repetitive and empty minigame with no longevity to it after an hour. The game was released at the beginning of November, yet in February 2021, most of those bugs from November are still present, and more have been introduced in updates along the way. The game tries so hard to please classic Assassin's Creed fans, RPG Assassin's Creed fans, and newcomers to the franchise alike, that despite a few moments of brilliance, it loses its own identity so often, and could just as easily be any other game in maybe 80 of the 100 hours. There were moments in this game where I could feel myself willing it to lean into what had just been put on screen, wanting to like the game, its setting, story, and characters. There is enough here to spark that want over and over again throughout my playthrough. And despite tempering my expectations going in, there were enough tantalising moments dangled in front of me that my excitement peaked on many occasions. But all too quickly you move on to something else that then undermines those beautiful moments to try and please a different subset of fans, who will then be just as let down when the next subset gets their moment. Valhalla was backed into a corner at this point in a supposed trilogy. With no interweaving story from Origins to Odyssey to Valhalla, we had to be thrust into a generic situation to conclude Layla's story. The writing team attempt to link this adrift franchise back to what spawned it, and the attempt has many memorable and impactful moments for many different types of Assassin's Creed fan. You can tell that the gameplay would be much more fun if the team had had time to polish it rather than just rush it out. And despite the feeling of age in the engine, given that time, gameplay wouldn't then be hampered. There are many steps in the right direction in this game. Bringing it back to a more realistic approach, actually having assassins in Assassin's Creed, strong story moments and story threads being pulled from elsewhere in the franchise, science fiction instead of fantasy, and a strong, well-rounded, canonical female lead. It does, in its best moments, breed hope for the future of the franchise, but it all depends on what comes next. And if the likes of Ubisoft Quebec are in charge, you can almost guarantee that all of Valhalla's good work will be immediately undone. I can't say that this is a great game, or even a good one for that matter, because it just isn't. There are too many things that detract from the experience and cause you as the player frustration that I cannot say that it is worth the money that people are putting down on it, even in sales. I hope that the future will show that this is a really good launch platform, and that Darby and his team, through story alone, set up a return to form for the franchise. But that is something that we will only know with hindsight in the future. In the meantime, it is probably better to just watch somebody else play it, and avoid the frustrations of the game yourself. And then wait for reviews on all future titles, to see if they will actually suit you. And so here we are, finally. At the end of the video, and the unscripted part where I just ramble at a microphone for you guys. This has been a big undertaking, this review. I wanted to review Valhalla because it's a series that I adore, even now, even with the problems that I feel we're facing. I still adore it, and I want it to be good. But I also want to put real and legitimate criticisms out there for Ubisoft to take on board. If there's anything good that you can say about Ubisoft, it's that they do actually take criticisms. The reason the style and design of this franchise has changed so drastically over the course of its 14-year history is because they listen to media and fans alike. But more often than not, it's the loud pockets that don't represent everybody else that get heard, simply because they are loud. So I wanted to put this out there for people like me, fans of the classic Assassin's Creed experience. One, to see if it would be something suitable for their liking, their tastes, and their time investment. But also, so Ubisoft could maybe see this, maybe hear the criticisms, and realise that there is a big majority of your fans that want a classic style Assassin's Creed in a modern casing. We don't want The Witcher 3 with an Assassin's Creed flavour. We don't want Grand Theft Auto with an Assassin's Creed flavour. Some people might take Ghost of Tsushima with an Assassin's Creed flavour, but the reason so many of us are here is we want Assassin's Creed with a something else flavour. It's what the likes of Black Flag, AC3, Brotherhood, Unity, and even Syndicate did really well. It was Assassin's Creed at its core. It gave you the player fantasy of being an assassin, gave you incredibly good animations and controls, and a brilliant, massive living world, especially when you look at the likes of Unity. Free running was always there. It was always intense, executable, and in depth. There was never anything simplistic or easy about it, even at the base level. Everything else can be changed around that. It can give you a different flavour, a different taste. But it feels like that different flavour and taste has been the focus in more recent times, rather than the flavour. I hope that they reassess what Assassin's Creed is, hear the concerns of the core fan base, as I would like to call them, the guys who've been there since the very beginning or very early on, and maybe give us something that suits us more. There is nothing wrong with having an RPG game set within the Assassin's Creed universe. but maybe it shouldn't be a core game and it should be an offshoot, a spin-off title even. There are ways to please all factors of this fanbase, but I don't feel that it's in a single game. And unfortunately, it's not for me to help them figure it out. It's down to them, their feedback from the fan bases, and reviews like this. So sound off in the comments yourself. How are you feeling about Assassin's Creed as a whole? How are you feeling about Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Do you like the whole mythical lean that we've had in these last 3 iterations? Or do you prefer the more realistic technological approach that we had in the more classic games? Whatever your thoughts, if you are still here at this point in the review, I am so grateful for your viewership. I would ask one more thing of you, and that would be to like the video, share it around, subscribe and hit that bell for notifications, because there will be much more content coming your way, whether it's playthroughs, reviews, or just weird ramblings on the internet as we YouTubers sometimes do. In the meantime, guys, I would like to thank you all very much for tuning in. My name is Doragon, this is my full review of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and until next time, folks, have yourselves a fantastic day, and take care.
For noble deeds thine honor sing. We beat and blaze our trail of red, till Odin gazed upon the dead. The voice resound the mighty all. For those who fight, for those who fall. For those who fight and those who fall. May horns resound the mighty hall. For we who fight, for we who fall.